Thurston Vandermeer III thought his wife died the day he filed for divorce, broken, penniless, forgotten. But when the doors of the Smithsonian Gala opened that October night, he didn't just see a ghost. He saw the woman who would destroy everything he built on her ashes, and the cruelest part, she'd already won. The morning of October 14th began the way most mornings had begun in the Vandermeer penthouse for the past 3 years, with absence disguised as urgency. Thurston stood in the marble foyer checking his Patek Philippe, while his driver idled 23 floors below. The watch had cost more than most people earned in a year, but that wasn't why he wore it. He wore it because men like him always did. Sebastian sat at the breakfast table, 7 years old today, fork hovering over untouched pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. His mother had woken at 5:30 to make them from scratch the way she always did on birthdays, the way her own mother had done before the cancer took her when Cordelia was 16. Thurston crossed the room, placed a hand on his son's head. The gesture felt practiced, mechanical, like signing documents he barely read. "Daddy's got to fight some bad guys at the office today, champ. Big meeting. Very important people counting on me." Sebastian's eyes stayed on the syrup pooling around a stegosaurus tail. "But you said we'd get the telescope. You promised." The Edison Limited Edition. $4,000. Thurston had indeed promised 3 weeks ago, circled the date on the refrigerator calendar in red marker. But that was before the Atlantic City expansion hit complications, before the liquidity issue with the offshore accounts, before Sloan started asking when he'd finally leave his wife. "I know, buddy, and we will. Tonight. Daddy will bring it home tonight, I swear." Cordelia appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, hair pulled back in a loose knot. No makeup. She hadn't worn makeup at home in months. What was the point? Thurston barely looked at her anymore, and when he did, his eyes held the same distant appraisal he gave to furniture he was considering replacing. She met her husband's gaze across the kitchen. Something passed between them, not affection, not even recognition, just the tired acknowledgement of two people playing roles neither believed in anymore. "You'll be home by 6. Thurston was already moving toward the elevator, briefcase in hand, mind 3 conversations ahead. "Absolutely. 6 sharp. I've got it in my calendar." The elevator doors closed on his smile, that practiced curve of lips that had closed 1,000 deals and opened 1,000 doors. Cordelia watched the numbers descend. 23, 22, 21. Each floor, another layer of distance between promise and reality. She turned back to Sebastian, who had given up on the dinosaurs and was drawing in the syrup with his finger. "Mommy, is Daddy really coming home early?" 7 years old. Already learning that words from certain people meant less than the silence that followed them. Cordelia knelt beside his chair, took his sticky hand in hers. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I am. And we're going to have the best birthday dinner ever. Just you and me, your favorite place, the one with the big steaks and the chocolate cake that's taller than your head." Sebastian's smile came slow, cautious, like he was testing whether this promise would break too. "Can I get extra whipped cream?" "You can get 3 extra whipped creams." 4. "Don't push it, mister." The laugh that bubbled out of him sounded like relief. Cordelia held it close, that sound stored it away for later when she'd need to remember why any of this mattered. By 2 o'clock that afternoon she had called Thurston's office 4 times. His assistant Jessica had the decency to sound apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "Mrs. Vandermeer, he's in back-to-back meetings. The merger situation with the Boston property. You know how these things get." Cordelia knew. She'd been knowing for 3 years, ever since the night she'd found the credit card statement showing charges at the Bellagio the same week Thurston claimed to be in meetings in Philadelphia. She'd known through the late-night phone calls he took in his study with the door locked, through the weekends he spent at the Atlantic City casino reviewing operations that somehow required 48 hours and returned him home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. She knew. But knowing and confronting were different countries, and she'd been living in the former for so long she'd forgotten the language of the latter. At 2:47 her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. because even the courtesy of hearing his voice had become too much to spare. Crisis with the Boston investors. Can't make dinner. Reschedule for the weekend. Tell Sebastian I'm sorry. Order him something nice from me. Cordelia read it 3 times. The first time she felt the familiar sting of disappointment. The second time, anger began to kindle. The third time, something colder settled in her chest. Not rage, but clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about what you already know. She stood in the center of their living room, 1,700 square feet of designer furniture and art she'd helped him select back when he still asked her opinion about things. The Rothko above the fireplace. The Noguchi coffee table. The first edition Hemingways in the built-in shelves. All of it acquired during those early years when he'd listened to her talk about provenance and composition, when her knowledge had seemed exotic and valuable rather than decorative and obsolete. Sebastian was in his room building something elaborate with Legos, the afternoon light slanting through windows that overlooked Central Park. She watched him for a moment. This small person she'd made, this boy who was learning that love came with conditions and promises had expiration dates. Not today. Not his birthday. She grabbed her phone, scrolled through contacts until she found the number she needed. Victoria. It's Cordelia. I need a favor. Victoria Drummond had been her roommate at Yale back when Cordelia was 18, and certain the world would bend to accommodate brilliance and passion. They'd stayed close even after Cordelia dropped out to marry Thurston, even after Victoria became a celebrated art dealer in Soho, while Cordelia became someone who attended charity luncheons and organized her husband's social calendar. Name it. Can you get me into the Capitol Grill tonight, Washington? I know it's last minute, but say no more. I know the manager. 7:30 work. Perfect. She hung up and looked at Sebastian, still building, still believing today might end differently than it had started. Get your good shirt on, baby. We're going on an adventure. The drive from Manhattan to Washington took 4 hours. They sang along to the radio, played the alphabet game with highway signs, stopped at a rest stop where Sebastian got a hot pretzel that left salt crystals on his cheeks. For those 4 hours, Cordelia pushed away the text message, the broken promise, the marriage that had been dying by degrees for so long she'd stopped noticing the decay. The Capitol Grill occupied a corner of K Street, all dark wood and leather, and the kind of hushed elegance that came with prices designed to exclude. The maitre d' recognized Victoria's name, led them to a corner booth with burgundy upholstery and a view of the entire dining room. Cordelia ordered Sebastian the filet mignon, medium rare, and didn't object when he asked for Shirley Temple with extra cherries. She ordered wine for herself, a Bordeaux she knew cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Thurston's credit card. Let him see the charge later. Let him wonder. Sebastian was explaining the intricacies of his Lego space station when Cordelia's attention snagged on movement near the entrance. Her hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Thurston walked through the door like he owned the building, which for all she knew he might. He wore the charcoal Tom Ford suit, the one she'd helped him pick out for the Metropolitan Museum Gala last spring. His silver hair caught the light just so that distinguished gray he'd cultivated since his early 50s, the kind that made men look authoritative and women look old. And clinging to his arm, laughing at something he'd just whispered, was a woman Cordelia had never seen before. She was young, 28, maybe 30, red hair that fell in calculated waves past her shoulders. A dress that cost what Cordelia used to make in a month back when she had her own income, back when she was a person separate from being Mrs. Thurston Vandermeer III. Cordelia's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and throat. The wine in her mouth turned to ash. Sebastian was still talking something about oxygen recycling systems, his voice a distant hum beneath the rushing in her ears. She watched Thurston guide the woman girl, really young enough to be his daughter, toward a table on the opposite side of the restaurant. A corner table, intimate, the kind you request when you don't want to be seen. But the thing that made Cordelia's stomach plummet, the detail that transformed suspicion into certainty, was the necklace. Harry Winston. Sapphires set in platinum, the centerpiece a stone the size of a quail's egg. Cordelia had seen it before. She'd stood in front of the display case at the Sotheby's preview in New York 3 weeks ago, admired the craftsmanship, done the mental math on the starting bid. $18 million. The auction had been last week. She'd seen the results online, sold to an anonymous bidder. Not so anonymous anymore. Thurston pulled out the girl's chair with the same practiced gallantry he'd once used with Cordelia, back when they were new, back when he'd made her feel like the only woman in every room. The girl sat, touched the sapphire at her throat, smiled up at him with the kind of adoration that came easy when you didn't yet know how it felt to be replaced. Cordelia's phone sat on the table next to her untouched salad. She picked it up, hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest, and opened the camera. Zoomed. The image on her screen was grainy, but clear enough. Thurston holding the girl's hand across the white tablecloth. Thurston laughing, his whole face animated in a way it hadn't been at home in years. Thurston leaning in to kiss her knuckles, that old-world gesture he'd once used to make Cordelia feel like she'd stepped into a black-and-white film where love was sweeping and eternal. Click, click, click. Each photo felt like documentation of a crime, evidence for a trial she hadn't known she'd be prosecuting. Mom, are you listening? Sebastian's voice pulled her back. She lowered the phone, forced her face into something resembling attention. Of course, baby. Tell me about the oxygen system. But she wasn't listening. She was watching Thurston order wine, watching the sommelier nod with the deference reserved for men who tipped in hundreds. She was watching the girl lean forward, giving him a view of cleavage barely constrained by expensive silk. She was watching her husband play a role, the distinguished older man, the powerful lover, the one who'd chosen youth over history, and perform it with the ease of someone who'd been rehearsing for months. Maybe years. The waiter appeared with Sebastian's steak. Cordelia cut it into pieces. Her son could manage the knife, sawing through meat that might as well have been cardboard for all she tasted. Sebastian dug in, happy, oblivious, 7 years old and still young enough to believe his mother could shield him from every hurt. She had to get him out of here, had to leave before Thurston turned his head, before he saw them, before Sebastian had to watch his father with another woman on his birthday. But she couldn't move. Some part of her needed to see this, needed to burn this image into her memory so deeply that later, when doubt tried to creep in, when she questioned her own perceptions, she'd have this moment crystallized in perfect, agonizing clarity. Across the restaurant, Thurston raised his glass. The girl mirrored him, sapphires catching candlelight. They drank, and even from 30 feet away, Cordelia could see the way he looked at her. Like she was rare, valuable, worth protecting. The way he used to look at Cordelia. Sebastian finished his steak, started eyeing the dessert menu. Cordelia pulled cash from her wallet. Her own money, what little remained in the private account her grandmother had set up before she died, and left it on the table. Too much probably, but she couldn't stay here calculating percentages. Change of plans, sweetheart. Let's get dessert to go. Ice cream sundaes in the car. Even better, right? Sebastian's face fell just slightly, but he was used to plans changing, used to adapting. He nodded, slid out of the booth, took her hand. They walked past Thurston's table, close enough that if he'd turned his head, if he'd glanced away from his 28-year-old distraction for even a second, he would have seen his wife and son leaving his favorite restaurant on his son's birthday. He didn't turn. Cordelia kept walking. Sebastian's hand small and warm in hers, each step carrying her further from the marriage she'd thought she had, and closer to something else. Something she couldn't name yet, but could feel building like pressure before a storm. The drive back to Manhattan passed in a blur of highway lights and Sebastian's chatter about whether space stations could have dogs eventually giving way to the soft breathing of sleep. Cordelia drove on autopilot, her mind replaying the restaurant scene on loop. The necklace, the hand-kissing, the way Thurston had looked so alive, so present, so utterly engaged in a way he hadn't been at home since before Sebastian was born. Maybe longer. They reached the penthouse at midnight. Cordelia carried Sebastian to his room, tucked him in, still wearing his good shirt because waking him seemed cruel. She stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, this small person whose father had forgotten him today. Not forgotten, chosen to forget. There was a difference. She walked to the master bedroom, empty as she'd known it would be. Thurston's side of the bed remained pristine, undisturbed. The pillow still held the impression from whenever he'd last slept here. 2 nights ago, 3, she'd stopped tracking. Cordelia changed into pajamas, washed her face, went through the motions of normalcy, even as something fundamental cracked inside her. She should cry. That's what women in movies did when they discovered their husbands' affairs. They cried and threw things and demanded explanations. But she didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. In their place was something harder, colder, a kind of rage that had frozen solid after years of being slowly heated degree by degree until the transformation became irreversible. She picked up her phone, scrolled through the photos from the restaurant, zoomed in on the necklace, the intertwined hands. Thurston's face caught mid-laugh. She'd been married to this man for 7 years. Before that, they'd dated for 3. A decade of her life poured into loving someone who'd apparently checked out so completely he couldn't even remember his own son's birthday. Her phone buzzed. A text. "Don't wait up. Closing a deal. Big one. This could change everything." Cordelia read it twice. The audacity of the lie, the sheer contemptuous assumption that she was stupid enough to believe it. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her laptop, created a new folder, uploaded the restaurant photos, named it with just a date, October 14th, 2023. Then she did something she'd been avoiding for months, maybe years. She went looking. Thurston kept his home office locked when he was gone, but Cordelia had lived in this penthouse since they'd bought it. She knew where he hid things. The spare key taped under the 3rd drawer of the hall console, the same place he'd kept spare keys in their old apartment, his old house, every residence they'd ever shared. Some patterns went too deep to change. The office smelled like him. Scotch and leather and the particular cologne he special ordered from a place in London that probably cost more per ounce than most people's car payments. She sat at his desk, the chair still warm, which meant he'd been here recently. Today, probably. Before the restaurant. His computer was encrypted, but she wasn't looking for digital evidence. Not yet. She opened desk drawers, found the usual detritus of executive life. Penn's business cards, printed emails about the Atlantic City expansion. A box of condoms hidden beneath a stack of legal documents, because of course there was. The bottom drawer was locked. Different lock, different key. Cordelia sat back thinking. Thurston was methodical about some things, careless about others. He kept his important papers in a safe deposit box at First Bank of Philadelphia, the family institution where Vandermeers had stored their valuables since 1847. But he also had a habit of keeping working copies at home, documents he needed to reference frequently. She stood, walked to the bookshelf that lined the western wall. First editions. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner. Thurston collected them the way some men collected sports memorabilia, proof of sophistication purchased rather than earned. Behind the Hemingways, tucked into the gap between shelf and wall, her fingers found metal. A key. The bottom drawer opened to reveal something she hadn't expected: chaos. Bank statements from institutions she'd never heard of. Cayman Islands, Singapore, Luxembourg. Accounts under names that weren't theirs, shell corporations, LLCs with acronyms instead of identities. She pulled out a stack, started reading. The numbers made her dizzy. Transfers. Millions moving in and out like tidal patterns. $340 million through something called Vandermeer Holdings, LLC, over the past 18 months. But it was the withdrawals that made her hands shake. Regular payments to an account labeled simply TGG Operations. She grabbed another statement. More payments to TGG, always in round numbers. 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. Like installments, like debt repayment. Under the bank statements, she found something worse. Printed emails between Thurston and someone named R. Gallagher. The messages were terse, careful, the kind of language people used when they knew electronic communication could be subpoenaed. The Boston situation is handled. TGG is satisfied for now. But they're asking about the foundation money. You need to deliver by end of Q4 or things get complicated. Understood. The charity event will provide cover. Nobody questions philanthropic transfers. We'll move it through the usual channels. Sloan is getting nervous. She thinks someone's watching. You need to keep her calm. Sloan. the red-haired girl from the restaurant. Cordelia read faster, her heart rate climbing. More emails. References to operations in Atlantic City. Coded language about games and players and houses. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and when she did, the room seemed to tilt. Thurston wasn't just running casinos. He was running something else through them. Illegal gambling operations, money laundering. The legitimate casino business was cover for something much larger, much darker. And TGG, whoever they were, owned him. She heard the elevator chime in the hallway. Footsteps. Thurston was home. Cordelia moved fast, shoving papers back into the drawer, locking it, replacing the key. She was in the hallway when Thurston emerged from the elevator tie, loosened, looking exhausted, or perhaps just drunk. His eyes had that glassy quality that came from expensive wine consumed without sufficient food. They stood there 10 feet apart in the hallway of their home, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled with everything they weren't saying. Finally Thurston broke it. "You're still up." Not an observation. An accusation. As if her consciousness was an inconvenience. "It's Sebastian's birthday." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe. Or just annoyance at being reminded. "I know. I said I'd make it up to him this weekend. You said you'd be home at 6. Plans change. I texted you. You texted me that you had a crisis with Boston investors." She watched him carefully, waited to see if he'd maintain the lie or pivot to a new one. He chose pivot. It got resolved earlier than expected. But then there was dinner with the team. Celebrating. You know how these things go. The Capitol Grill, K Street. His face went very still. The drunk glassiness sharpened into something like alertness, like wariness. "How did you—" "Sebastian wanted steak for his birthday, so I took him there. Imagine my surprise when I saw you walk in with a woman wearing an $18 million necklace." The color drained from Thurston's face, leaving him pale beneath his expensive tan. "Cordelia, it's not what it looked like." How many times had she heard variations of that phrase? How many times had she accepted it, tucked away her doubts, chosen peace over truth? "What is it, then? Explain it to me." He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture he used when stalling, when buying time to construct a plausible narrative. "Sloane Gallagher. She's the daughter of one of our major investors, Robert Gallagher. He's funding the Atlantic City expansion. The necklace was a closing gift. Business. I was entertaining her to keep her father happy. It's all business." "You kissed her hand." It's old-fashioned courtesy. You know how I am." She did know. That was the problem. She knew exactly how he was, and for the first time in years she was allowing herself to see it clearly. "You took her to our restaurant, the place we went for our anniversary." "It's not our restaurant, it's just a restaurant." The casual dismissal, the reduction of something that had meant something to nothing, this was Thurston's particular cruelty, not violence but erasure. The slow deletion of meaning until nothing remained but his version of reality. Cordelia felt something shift inside her like a lock tumbling open. "I want to see your phone." "Excuse me." "Your phone. Unlock it. Give it to me." His face hardened, the charm dropping away like a mask removed. "Don't be ridiculous. I have client confidentiality, sensitive business information." "Then just your texts with Sloane." "Cordelia, you're being paranoid. This is exactly the kind of behavior that—" He stopped himself, but she heard what he'd almost said. That drove me away, that made me look elsewhere, that justified his betrayal. She took a step toward him. "I found your drawer." The words hung between them like a blade. Thurston's entire body tensed. "What drawer?" "The locked one in your office. Bank statements. Cayman Islands. Singapore. $340 million. TGG operations." Sloane getting nervous about being watched. The silence that followed felt like falling, like the moment between stepping off a ledge and hitting ground. When Thurston spoke, his voice was different, quieter, the voice he probably used when discussing things that couldn't be unsaid. You had no right to go through my things. We're married. Those things are legally mine too. Not for long. The words landed like a physical blow. Cordelia actually stepped back, her spine hitting the wall. Thurston straightened and she saw him making a calculation, deciding how much to reveal, how much to admit, whether to keep lying or burn everything down. He chose burning. I filed for divorce yesterday. The papers will be served Monday. You'll find the terms generous considering you contributed nothing to the assets acquired during our marriage. Cordelia's vision narrowed to a pinpoint. The hallway, the man, the words still echoing. Nothing. I built this empire. I made the deals. I took the risks. You decorated apartments and planned parties. I used my inheritance to save you from bankruptcy. $250,000 from my grandmother's trust. You swore you'd pay it back. That was 10 years ago. Consider it payment for services rendered. The clinical cruelty of it, the reduction of a decade to a transaction. And Sebastian? Something flickered in Thurston's eyes. Not quite guilt, maybe just awareness that even he had limits. The prenup is clear. Primary custody stays with me. You'll get visitation, supervised initially until we can establish that you're stable. Stable. My lawyers have documented concerning behavior, erratic spending, paranoia, depression. It's all very sad, really, but Sebastian needs stability. He needs to be with the parent who can provide for him. Cordelia understood then what she was looking at. Not a man having an affair, a man executing a plan. The affair was just one piece. The divorce was calculated, the custody strategy already in motion. How long had he been planning this? You're going to take my son, our son, and I'm going to give him the life he deserves, without the chaos you'd bring. He moved past her toward the master bedroom, already done with this conversation, already moving forward to whatever life he'd constructed without her in it. Cordelia stood in the hallway, her body numb, her mind racing through everything she'd just learned. The affair, the divorce, the custody strategy, the illegal money laundering, the web of lies so complex she'd been living inside it without seeing the threads. She walked back to the office, to the locked drawer, pulled out more papers. Found the prenuptial agreement signed when she was 21 and stupidly in love. Read the terms she'd barely glanced at back then, too certain of forever to imagine a version of herself standing here reading the blueprint of her own destruction. Primary custody to the parent with greater financial resources and stability. Cordelia would get 2 weekends a month. Maybe, if she behaved, if she didn't fight, if she accepted the crumbs Thurston was willing to grant. She thought of Sebastian asleep down the hall, 7 years old, about to have his world torn apart by lawyers and custody evaluations, and a father who'd forgotten his birthday. The rage that had been building all day crystallized into something sharp and clear. Not hot anger, but cold calculation. Thurston thought he'd won because he'd planned, because he had lawyers and money and a prenup written when she was too young to understand what she was signing. But Thurston had made mistakes. The bank statements were proof. The emails were evidence. The shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the payments to TGG operations. All of it documented, filed, left in a drawer he thought she'd never open. He'd underestimated her, dismissed her as decorative, irrelevant, defeated before the battle began. That was his first mistake. Cordelia pulled out her phone, photographed every document in the drawer. Bank statements, emails, the prenup, all of it. Uploaded them to a cloud account Thurston didn't know existed, one she'd opened years ago when the first whisper of doubt had entered her marriage. Then she put everything back exactly as she'd found it, locked the drawer, replaced the key. She walked to the master bedroom. Thurston was already in bed, facing away from her, either asleep or pretending to be. She stood in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders, this man she'd loved enough to abandon her own dreams for. "I'm not going to make this easy for you." He didn't move, didn't respond. Maybe he really was asleep. Maybe he just didn't care enough to acknowledge her. Cordelia turned, walked back to Sebastian's room, climbed into the small bed beside her son. He stirred, wrapped an arm around her waist, mumbled something about space stations. She held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, feeling the steady drum of his heartbeat against her ribs. This was what mattered. Not the penthouse or the marriage or the life that was ending, whether she fought it or not. This small person who still believed she could protect him from everything. She'd find a way. Somehow. Even if she had to burn down everything Thurston had built to do it. He thought the war was over. It hadn't even started. The process server arrived on a Tuesday morning while Sebastian was at school. Cordelia signed for the envelope with hands that didn't shake, thanked the woman in the cheap polyester suit, and closed the door before opening the packet that would legally end her marriage. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Thurston Vandermeer III petitioner. Cordelia Sterling Vandermeer respondent. The language was clinical sterile, reducing 10 years to numbered paragraphs, and whereas clauses. She read standing in the foyer, morning light slanting through windows that overlooked a park she could no longer afford to live near. The terms were exactly as brutal as Thurston had promised. Primary physical custody to petitioner. Respondent granted supervised visitation 2 weekends per month pending psychiatric evaluation to establish fitness. Division of assets. Petitioner retains all property acquired during marriage, including primary residence, vacation properties, investment portfolios. Respondent receives no spousal support due to brief duration of marriage and prenuptial agreement executed prior to union. Brief duration, 7 years. A tenth of her life, apparently insufficient to merit consideration. The psychiatric evaluation requirement stopped her cold. She read it 3 times, understanding blooming like poison. Thurston wasn't just leaving. He was building a narrative. Unstable wife, erratic behavior, unfit mother. All documented, his lawyers claimed through witness statements and medical opinions from a Dr. Harrington she'd never met. Cordelia walked to the living room, sat on the Noguchi coffee table she'd found at an estate sale in Connecticut back when Thurston still valued her eye for beauty. The papers felt heavy in her lap, weighted with implications that extended far beyond legal terminology. If she fought this, she'd lose. Thurston had money lawyers, a documented strategy. She had nothing, no income, no assets in her name. Even the wedding ring on her finger technically belonged to the Vandermeer family estate, an heirloom his mother had given him to bestow on whatever woman he chose. She twisted the ring platinum and diamonds, remembering the night he'd slipped it on her finger at a restaurant in Boston's North End. 21 years old, certain she'd found something rare and permanent. The ring came off easily. She'd lost weight over the past year without noticing her body shrinking as her world contracted. She set it on the coffee table, this symbol of promises neither of them had kept. Her phone rang, Victoria's name on the screen. "Tell me you got a lawyer." Cordelia walked to the window, watched joggers circle the reservoir below. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "Bullshit. You have that account your grandmother left you." "Had. I used it to save Thurston from bankruptcy 10 years ago. There's maybe 3,000 left." Silence on the other end, thick with implications, Victoria was too kind to voice. Finally, "Come to New York. Today. I know someone you need to meet." "Victoria, I can't just—" "Yes, you can. Sebastian's at school until 3. You have time. Get on a train." The trip from Philadelphia to New York took 90 minutes. Cordelia spent them staring at her reflection in the train window, seeing a stranger. When had she stopped recognizing herself? When had the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Yale, who'd been offered a full scholarship to Columbia for art history, who'd been described by her professors as once in a generation, vanished into this hollow-eyed ghost? Victoria met her at Penn Station, pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than comfortable, as if proximity alone could transfer strength. "You look terrible." "Thank you. Very helpful." "I mean it. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't picked off Sebastian's plate?" Cordelia couldn't remember. Food had become theoretical, something she prepared for others without consuming herself. They took a cab to Soho, to a gallery tucked between a boutique selling $1,000 sweatshirts and a coffee shop that served espresso in beakers. The gallery was closed, but Victoria had keys. She led Cordelia past installations of twisted metal and canvases that looked like violence rendered in primary colors up a flight of stairs to an office that smelled of turpentine and old money. Behind a desk made from reclaimed barnwood sat a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a daguerreotype. 70, maybe older, with silver hair swept back from a face that had aged into distinguished rather than old. He wore a three-piece suit in charcoal wool, a watch chain visible across his vest, and when he stood to greet them, his movements carried the careful grace of someone who'd learned deportment when such things were still taught. Augustus Blackwood. His handshake was firm, brief, and he gestured to chairs upholstered in leather that had probably cost more than Cordelia's monthly expenses. "Victoria tells me you're in trouble." Cordelia glanced at her friend, who'd settled into the other chair with the ease of someone who'd been here before. "My husband filed for divorce. He's trying to take my son." Augustus steepled his fingers, a gesture that reminded Cordelia of old movies of a world where manners were armor and courtesy concealed calculation. "Thurston Vandermeer. I knew your husband's father. Terrible man. Brilliant businessman, but terrible. Beat his wife, drank himself into cirrhosis by 55. The son seemed like an improvement. Less violent, more strategic. But strategy without conscience is just cruelty with better PR." He opened a folder on his desk, withdrew a single photograph. Black and white, the kind that came from film rather than digital capture. A woman in her 20s, dark hair pinned back, wearing a dress from another era. "Your grandmother, Lillian Sterling." Cordelia took the photo, her breath catching. She'd seen pictures of her grandmother before, but never this one. Never Lillian looking so young, so alive, her whole future still ahead of her. "You knew her." "I loved her. For 40 years from a distance that circumstances demanded but affection couldn't quite bridge." He stood, walked to the window overlooking Spring Street, hands clasped behind his back. "Lillian was promised to someone else before she met me. Old Philadelphia family. The marriage was arranged, the kind of arrangement people don't make anymore but used to treat like business contracts. She honored it. Had your mother. Stayed married to a man who valued her bloodline more than her soul." Augustus turned back to face her. "But she had resources he didn't know about. Her grandfather had been a collector, you see. Started in the 1840s buying paintings from artists nobody valued yet. Kept them in a vault in Philadelphia, away from husbands who might sell them to fund gambling debts or mistresses." Cordelia's pulse quickened. She thought of the locket her grandmother had left her, the one piece of jewelry Thurston had deemed worthless enough to let her keep. Sterling silver, tarnished with a broken clasp. She'd worn it for years, then tucked it away in a drawer when Thurston made some dismissive comment about costume jewelry. "When Lillian died, she left that collection to your mother. But your mother never claimed it. She was sick by then, the cancer already in her bones. She died 6 months after her mother, and the vault passed to you." "I don't understand. I never received anything about a vault." Augustus smiled, the expression sad and knowing at once. "Your grandmother knew your mother was dying, knew you'd be 18, alone, vulnerable, so she buried the instructions. Put them somewhere you'd find them only when you needed them most." He gestured to the locket. "You're wearing it." Cordelia's hand went to her throat, but the locket wasn't there. She hadn't worn it in years. "It's at home, in my jewelry box." "Go home. Look inside it. Really look. Your grandmother was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them." The train back to Philadelphia felt slower than the one there, each minute stretching as Cordelia's mind raced through possibilities. A vault. A collection. Resources she didn't know existed. It felt like fairy tale logic, too convenient to be real. And yet Augustus Blackwood wasn't the type to traffic in false hope. He dealt in art worth millions, advised collectors whose names appeared in Forbes. Men like that didn't lie about provenance. She made it home before Sebastian's bus arrived, went straight to the master bedroom. The jewelry box sat on her dresser, mahogany inlaid with mother of pearl, a gift from Thurston on their first anniversary back when he still gave gifts that weren't apologies disguised as jewelry. The locket lay at the bottom, tangled with broken necklaces and single earrings that had lost their mates. She worked it free, held it up to the light. Sterling silver, yes. Tarnished, yes. But heavier than she remembered. She pressed the clasp. It opened to reveal not photographs, as she'd always assumed, but something else. The interior had been hollowed out, the space where pictures should be replaced with a small cavity. Inside a key, brass old with an elaborate bow and a number engraved on the shaft, 1847. Her hands shook as she turned the locket over. The back, which she'd never examined closely, bore an engraving she'd mistaken for decorative scrollwork. But looking closer, squinting, she could make out letters beneath the oxidation FBP, First Bank of Philadelphia, the oldest bank in the city, where the Vandermeer family kept their safe deposit boxes, where Thurston had once explained with the air of someone recounting ancient history that old Philadelphia families had been banking since before the Civil War. Cordelia grabbed her phone, called the bank. A woman answered with the kind of crisp professionalism that came from dealing with people who had more money than patience. "I need to access a safe deposit box. Number 1847. I'll need to verify your identity and authorization. Can I have your name?" "Cordelia Sterling." She paused, then added, "Vandermeer." Keyboard clicking. A long pause. More clicking. "Ms. Sterling, I show you as an authorized user on that box. The primary holder is listed as Lillian Sterling, deceased 2008. Per the terms of her will, access transferred to Cordelia Ann Sterling upon presentation of key and valid identification. I have the key. Can I come today? We close at 4. If you can be here by 3:30, I can accommodate you." Cordelia checked her watch. 2:15. Sebastian's bus arrived at 3. She called the school, arranged for him to go to his friend Marcus's house for a play date she'd have to invent an excuse for later. The bank occupied a corner of Market Street, all limestone and brass fittings, the kind of building that predated cars, and looked it. Cordelia presented her identification and the key to a woman whose hair was shellacked into a style that hadn't changed since 1985. The woman examined both, consulted a computer, made a phone call to verify something in hushed tones. "Follow me, please." They descended stairs to a basement vault, temperature-controlled and silent as a tomb. The woman unlocked a gate, led Cordelia down a corridor lined with steel doors, stopped at one marked 1847. "I'll need your key and mine." 2 locks, 2 simultaneous turns. The door opened to reveal not a small box, but a room. 8 by 10 feet walls lined with shelves, and on those shelves, paintings. Cordelia stepped inside, her breath catching. Even in the artificial light, even without proper examination, she could see quality. A landscape that had the saturated colors and meticulous detail of a Dutch Golden Age master. A portrait of a young woman, the brushwork suggesting Sargent or someone from his circle. A still life with the kind of technical precision that suggested centuries of craft passed down through guilds and ateliers. She moved closer to the landscape, looked for a signature. Found it in the lower right corner, Vermeer. Her knees went weak. She'd studied Vermeer at Yale. Knew his work the way musicians knew Bach. There were only 34 authenticated Vermeers in the world. She was looking at what might be the 35th. She turned to the portrait. Sargent, yes. Madame X era, before the scandal that made him famous. A portrait of someone's daughter, commissioned and completed, and apparently never claimed. The still life bore Caravaggio's distinctive chiaroscuro light and shadow playing across fruit and fabric with the drama of a stage set. Cordelia sank onto the single chair in the room, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Each painting would be worth millions at auction. Together, if authenticated, they represented a fortune that would make Thurston's casino empire look like pocket change. On a small desk in the corner, she found an envelope. Her name in her grandmother's handwriting, the ink faded but legible. She opened it with trembling fingers. "Dearest Cordelia, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you need what I've left you. I'm sorry for that. Sorry I couldn't protect you from whatever brought you here, but I can give you this freedom, power, the ability to choose what comes next. These paintings belong to my grandfather, who understood that beauty outlasts men and their cruelties. He bought them when no one valued them, kept them when others would have sold, and left them to me with instructions to pass them to a woman who would appreciate their worth. You are that woman. The collection has been appraised. The documentation is in the safe at the Blackwood Gallery in New York. Augustus will help you. He loved me once in the way good men love women they can't have, and he'll honor that love by protecting you. Don't let them make you small, darling girl. Don't let them convince you that survival is the same as victory. You are a sterling. We bend. We don't break. All my love." Grandmother Cordelia read the letter 3 times, then pressed it to her chest like a talisman. The vault around her hummed with climate control systems, keeping temperature and humidity at levels that would preserve art for centuries. Her grandmother had thought in centuries, had planned for futures she'd never see. She examined each painting more closely, counted 12 in total. Even conservative estimates would put the collection's value somewhere north of $1 billion. Thurston thought he'd won because he'd taken her present. But her grandmother had given her a past worth more than any future he could offer. The bank woman appeared in the doorway. "Do you need more time?" Cordelia looked at the Vermeer, the play of light across a landscape that had existed for 300 years and would exist for 300 more. "No, I need to make arrangements for transport. Can these remain here while I organize that?" "Of course. The vault is paid through 2050. Of course it was. Her grandmother had thought of everything. Cordelia emerged from the bank into afternoon sunlight that felt different than it had an hour ago. The world hadn't changed, but her place in it had. She was no longer the woman Thurston had dismissed as decorative and obsolete. She was the inheritor of a legacy that predated his family's money by centuries. She called Augustus from the street. "I saw them." His voice carried satisfaction. "I thought you might. Your grandmother was paranoid about provenance, insisted on keeping everything documented. I have letters from dealers' bills of sale going back to the 1840s, expert authentication from the top people in the field. Everything you'd need to sell or insure." "I'm not selling." "Smart. The market's good now, but it'll be better in 5 years. 10 years better still. Art appreciates. Husbands depreciate." Cordelia laughed, surprising herself. When had she last laughed? "I need help, legal help, the kind that can beat Thurston's lawyers." "I know people. But Cordelia, understand what you're starting. If you fight this publicly, everything comes out. His business practices, your inheritance, it'll be ugly." She thought of Sebastian, 7 years old, about to be caught in crossfire between parents who'd stopped being able to breathe the same air. "He's already made it ugly. I'm just making it fair." "Fair is a myth, but I can help you make it survivable. Come back to New York tomorrow. Bring the authentication documents from the vault. I'll introduce you to someone who specializes in making powerful men regret underestimating their wives." That evening, Cordelia picked up Sebastian from his playdate, listened to him chatter about Minecraft and snacks and whether his friend's hamster could be trained to use a tiny toilet. Normal child concerns. The kind that existed in a world where parents didn't wage war over custody and assets. She made him dinner, helped with homework, tucked him into bed. Stood in his doorway watching him sleep, this small person who'd inherited his father's silver-gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Thurston hadn't come home, hadn't called. The penthouse felt cavernous, empty in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. She went to his office, picked the lock on the bottom drawer again, photographed more documents, financial statements showing money moving through shell corporations, emails discussing TGG operations and timelines and pressure. One message in particular caught her attention, dated 3 weeks earlier. "Need to accelerate the divorce. TGG wants clean separation before the Boston deal closes. Wife can't have access to corporate records during discovery. Handle it." So that explained the timing, the sudden filing, the psychiatric evaluation strategy designed to make her seem unstable, unreliable, unworthy of equal access to information. Thurston wasn't divorcing her because he'd fallen out of love. He was divorcing her because she'd become a liability to whatever criminal enterprise he'd entangled himself in. Cordelia screenshot the email, added it to the growing file of evidence that would either save her or destroy them both. Her phone buzzed. "Victoria. You okay?" Define okay. Fair point. Augustus called. He's putting together a team. Lawyer, forensic accountant, PR specialist. People who've handled cases like this before. Cases like what? Rich men who thought their wives were furniture. Turns out furniture sometimes has teeth. Cordelia walked to the living room window, looked out at Central Park. Somewhere down there, people were living normal lives. Walking dogs, pushing strollers, believing in things like fairness and justice and marriages that lasted. "Victoria, what if I can't do this? What if I try to fight and he crushes me anyway?" Her friend's voice came back fierce, certain. "Then you go down swinging. But Cordelia, you're not going down. You're a Sterling. And from what Augustus tells me, your grandmother didn't raise women who lose." After they hung up, Cordelia sat in darkness, the only light coming from the city below. She thought about the paintings in the vault, the Vermeer landscape that had survived wars and revolutions, and centuries of men convinced their power was permanent. Art endured. Beauty persisted. And women who knew how to wait, how to plan, how to hide assets in plain sight, they survived. Her grandmother had survived a loveless marriage by creating secret wealth, had outlived the husband who'd treated her like breeding stock, had passed down not just money but strategy, not just art, but armor. Cordelia opened her laptop, started making notes. Names Augustus had mentioned, lawyers who specialized in high-asset divorce, forensic accountants who could trace money through offshore labyrinths. She worked until 3 in the morning, building a strategy that would have made her grandmother proud. When she finally slept, it was in Sebastian's bed again, his small body warm against hers, his breathing steady and sure. Tomorrow she'd call the lawyer. Tomorrow she'd start the process of becoming someone Thurston hadn't planned for. But tonight she held her son and remembered what she was fighting for. Not money, not revenge, not even justice, though she'd take that if it came. She was fighting for the right to be seen, to be valued, to exist as something other than decoration in someone else's story. And she was going to win. Not because she was stronger than Thurston or smarter or more ruthless, but because she'd finally stopped believing his version of who she was. And that made her dangerous in ways he couldn't begin to understand. The morning came too quickly, autumn light slanting through Sebastian's curtains patterned with constellations. She dressed carefully, choosing a suit she'd bought years ago for gallery openings she'd stopped attending. Navy blue tailored the kind of armor that looked like professionalism. The train to New York carried her through industrial zones and suburbs, past lives she'd never live and futures she'd never inhabit. At Penn Station, she took a cab directly to the address Augustus had texted, a building in Midtown, all glass and steel, the kind of place where billable hours started at 4 figures. The law office of Marlowe Hayes occupied the 42nd floor with views that made the city look like a toy model, pretty and manageable from this height. The receptionist, a young man with impeccable posture and a British accent that might have been real, showed her to a conference room. Marlowe Hayes was not what she expected. 50 maybe, with gray hair cut short and sharp, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Cordelia's wedding dress had. She stood when Cordelia entered, offered a handshake that conveyed strength without crushing. "Augustus speaks highly of you. That's rare. He usually speaks highly of no one." They sat. Marlowe placed a leather portfolio on the table between them, opened it to reveal a legal pad covered in notes. "I've reviewed what Augustus sent me. The prenup, the custody filing, the psychiatric evaluation requirement. Your husband's lawyers are good, Feldman and Associates. They specialize in high-net-worth divorce and they're ruthless. So how do we beat them?" Marlowe's smile was sharp as broken glass. "We don't beat them legally. Not at first. The prenup is solid and they have documentation for the psych eval. Fighting that head-on would drain resources and take years." Cordelia's heart sank. "Then what?" "We beat them publicly. We make it so toxic for Thurston to pursue this strategy that he abandons it voluntarily." She pulled out a tablet, turned it to face Cordelia. On screen, a draft press release. Vandermeer Foundation under investigation for financial irregularities. "Is this real?" "Not yet, but it can be. I have contacts at the SEC, the IRS agencies that would love to examine how Thurston's foundation moves money. Once we tip them off to the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the payments to TGG operations, they'll open formal investigations." Cordelia thought of Sebastian, his father's name on the news, FBI agents at school asking questions. I don't want my son growing up knowing I destroyed his father. Marlowe closed the tablet. Then you need to decide what you want more, protecting Sebastian from the truth or protecting him from a father who's already decided you're disposable, because Thurston will use that boy as a weapon. He'll turn Sebastian against you slowly, methodically, until your son believes you're the villain in this story. The words landed like stones in deep water ripples, spreading outward into implications Cordelia hadn't let herself consider. There has to be another way. There is. You roll over. Accept the terms. Take your 2 weekends a month and hope Thurston doesn't poison Sebastian against you too thoroughly before the boy's old enough to see through it. Marlowe stood, walked to the window, looked down at the city 42 floors below. I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen women with more resources than you, better prenups, stronger cases. You know what made the difference between the ones who got crushed and the ones who survived. Willingness to fight dirty when fighting clean wasn't enough. She turned back to face Cordelia. So decide, right now, are you willing to do what it takes? Because if you're not, we're wasting each other's time. Cordelia thought of the paintings in the vault, her grandmother's letter, the decades Lillian had spent in a marriage that treated her like property, planning her escape in secret, passing down the tools of resistance disguised as inheritance. She thought of Sebastian, 7 years old, learning that love came with conditions and mothers could be erased. She thought of the woman she'd been at 18, Yale scholarship, the world opening like a flower, convinced intelligence and passion would be enough. That woman had been a fool, but she'd also been brave. Time to remember how that felt. I'm willing. Tell me what we do first. Marlowe's plan began with silence. For 3 weeks, Cordelia did exactly nothing. Didn't respond to the divorce petition, didn't hire a different lawyer, didn't make noise. Let Thurston think he'd won by default. Meanwhile, Marlowe's forensic accountant, a woman named Chen who looked 25 but had apparently been dismantling financial fraud since the 90s, traced every dollar that had moved through Vandermeer Holdings. The shell corporations in the Caymans led to trusts in Delaware, which fed into LLCs in Nevada, which ultimately funneled money back to a single entity, the Gallagher Group, TGG Operations. Chen worked from a windowless office in Queens, surrounded by monitors displaying spreadsheets that looked like modern art. She pointed to a chart showing money flowing in elegant loops. Your husband isn't laundering money for organized crime, he's laundering it with them. Robert Gallagher runs legitimate casinos in Atlantic City and legitimate investment funds in Boston. But underneath that, he's running books for high-stakes illegal gambling operations across the eastern seaboard. Thurston's casinos provide the wash cycle. Cordelia sat in the only other chair, trying to follow numbers that kept multiplying into abstraction. How much? Over the past 3 years, $480 million. Thurston takes a 15% cut. $72 million in his pocket, mostly sheltered offshore. The IRS would weep. And Sloan? Chen pulled up another screen. A photograph of the red-haired woman from the restaurant, this time in business attire, at what looked like a corporate event. Sloan Gallagher, 28. Stanford MBA. Officially works as VP of Strategic Development for her father's investment firm. Unofficially serves as courier and insurance. If Thurston gets caught, she's positioned to testify that he acted alone, that the Gallaghers were innocent investors, defrauded by a rogue partner. But the necklace was a leash. $18 million of gemstones registered to Gallagher Group LLC, loaned to Miss Gallagher for public appearances. The moment Thurston stops being useful, she returns it and disappears. Your husband thought he was buying a mistress. He bought a babysitter. Chen closed one window, opened another. This one showed a timeline of phone records. Something else you should know. Sloan's made 4 calls to the FBI Witness Protection Hotline in the past month. Each time she hung up before speaking. She's scared. And people who are scared make different choices than people who are loyal. Cordelia absorbed this feeling, pieces click into place. She wants out. She wants out, but she's trapped between her father and your husband, and neither of them strikes me as the type to let assets walk away. Chen pulled up a third screen, this one showing news clippings. 3 obituaries from the past 5 years. A car accident in Delaware. A boating incident off Cape Cod. A heart attack victim aged 42, no prior health issues. The Gallagher group isn't just white-collar crime. These 3 people all had one thing in common. They tried to expose Robert Gallagher's operations. Car crash victim was an accountant who found irregularities. Boating incident was a former partner who threatened to go to the SEC. Heart attack was a journalist investigating illegal gambling in Atlantic City. Cordelia's mouth went dry. The FBI suspects but can't prove. Gallagher's very good at making problems disappear, and right now Thurston is becoming a problem. You're saying they might kill him? Chen's expression didn't change. I'm saying that if Thurston testifies against them, his life expectancy drops significantly. And if you push this into federal court, you need to understand that Sebastian's father might not survive long enough to serve his sentence. The weight of that settled over Cordelia like a shroud. She'd wanted justice, wanted Thurston to face consequences. But she hadn't quite imagined those consequences, including assassination. How do I protect him and Sebastian? You move fast. You make Thurston more valuable alive than dead. And you give the Gallaghers a bigger target to worry about than one desperate casino owner. Chen handed her a flash drive. Everything's on here. Financial records. The obituaries with my analysis of why they weren't accidents. Phone records showing communication between Robert Gallagher and known criminal associates. Give this to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Let them know the Gallaghers are the real prize. Thurston's just a means to get there. Cordelia pocketed the drive, feeling its weight like a weapon. The next phase of Marlowe's plan required Cordelia to become someone she'd never been visible. For 7 years she'd shrunk herself to fit Thurston's preferences. Quiet wife. Unobtrusive mother. Decoration that didn't demand attention. That ended now. Augustus arranged for her first public appearance, a fundraiser at the Museum of Modern Art Black Tie. The kind of event where old money pretended to care about contemporary art while really caring about being seen caring. Cordelia hadn't attended a gala in 3 years. Thurston had stopped inviting her, claiming she made awkward small talk and embarrassed him in front of clients. She'd believed him. Of course she had. Victoria arrived at the Berkshire house the day before the gala with a garment bag and a makeup artist who looked like she'd learned her craft backstage at Fashion Week. She'd also come bearing warnings. Augustus is lovely, truly, but don't underestimate him. The Blackwoods didn't stay powerful for 200 years by being nice. They're old money with old methods. When he offers protection, he means it in ways that would make the Gallaghers think twice. What kind of methods? Victoria's smile was knowing. The kind we don't discuss at brunch. Just know that if Augustus says you're safe, you're safe. He's eliminated bigger problems than Robert Gallagher. The dress was midnight blue, not black. Halston vintage from Victoria's personal collection. It fit like it had been made for Cordelia's body, emphasizing the weight she'd lost in ways that looked intentional rather than ill. The makeup artist worked in silence, her brushes moving with the precision of someone painting miniatures. When she finally stepped back, Cordelia looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. Cheekbones she'd forgotten she had. Eyes that looked larger, more focused. Lips the color of dark wine. The sapphires. Augustus had sent them over that morning. Not the $18 million necklace Sloane had worn that would be tasteless derivative. Instead, a suite that had belonged to Cordelia's grandmother. Sapphires and diamonds in an Art Deco setting, probably worth $2 million, but carrying the weight of provenance that new money couldn't purchase. Victoria fastened the necklace, stepped back to admire her work. You look like someone who owns things, expensive things, the kind men fight wars over. Cordelia touched the sapphires at her throat, felt their cool weight. I feel like I'm wearing a costume. Good. That's called armor. Wear it until it becomes skin. The gala transformed the museum into something between cathedral and marketplace. Waiters circulated with champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's weekly groceries. Women wore gowns that could have funded scholarships. Men wore success like cologne, the scent of it filling rooms before they entered. Cordelia walked in alone, refusing Victoria's offer to accompany her. This needed to be a statement she was here, unafraid, unaccompanied, not seeking protection or permission. The crowd parted without quite seeming to notice they were parting. Eyes tracked her progress across the marble floor. She heard whispers, the susurrus of gossip spreading like wind through grass. "That's Cordelia Vandermeer. I thought they were separated. She looks different." When did she start looking like that? Senator Drummond approached a woman in her 60s who'd known Cordelia's grandmother and served on the board of every institution that mattered in Philadelphia. "Cordelia Sterling, I wondered if we'd see you again." Not Vandermeer. Sterling. The deliberate use of her maiden name felt like recognition. "Senator, it's been too long. Far too long. Your grandmother would be pleased to see you here. She always said you had more spine than you showed." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing, art, politics, the weather. But beneath the small talk ran an undercurrent of assessment. The senator was deciding something, weighing Cordelia against some internal metric. Finally, "I hear Thurston's filed for divorce. Unfortunate." "Is it? I'm beginning to think it's the most honest thing he's done in years." The senator's smile was approving sharp. "You're more like Lillian than I realized. She survived Marcus Sterling by outliving him and spending his money on things that mattered. I suspect you'll do the same." She moved away, leaving Cordelia with the distinct impression she'd just passed some kind of test. More people approached as the evening progressed. Donors, collectors, museum board members who'd known her grandmother and remembered Cordelia as that brilliant girl who'd married too young and disappeared into domesticity. They welcomed her back like she'd returned from exile rather than just across town. No one mentioned Thurston. No one asked about the divorce. But everyone noticed she wasn't wearing her wedding ring, and the absence spoke louder than questions would have. At 9:30, the museum director took the stage to announce a major acquisition, a Rothko, from a private collection purchased with funds from the Blackwood Foundation. Augustus stood to acknowledge the applause, and for just a moment his eyes met Cordelia's across the room. This was the message she ran in different circles now. Had access to different resources. Was connected to power that existed independent of Thurston's world. Let him hear about it. Let him wonder. She left before the speeches ended, walking out into November cold that felt cleansing after the hothouse atmosphere of forced sophistication. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marlowe Feldman and Associates requested emergency conference. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. They heard about the gala. Bring Augustus. So Thurston had heard. Faster than she'd expected. The law offices of Feldman and Associates occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown, all glass and chrome, and the kind of aggressive minimalism that cost a fortune to achieve. Cordelia arrived with Augustus and Marlowe, a united front that announced she was no longer fighting alone. Thurston's lead attorney was a man named Feldman himself, 60-something with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from winter homes in places where seasons were suggestions. He stood when they entered, shook hands with the mechanical courtesy of someone who viewed civility as strategic rather than sincere. "Mrs. Vandermeer, Mr. Blackwood, Miss Hayes, thank you for coming on short notice." They settled around a conference table large enough to land aircraft. Feldman opened a leather portfolio, withdrew papers that looked like they'd been generated that morning. "My client is prepared to revise the settlement terms in light of certain developments." Marlowe leaned back, the picture of studied indifference. "What developments might those be?" "Mrs. Vandermeer's recent social activities, the MoMA Gala, Mr. Blackwood's public association with her interests. My client is concerned about optics, about the narrative this creates." Augustus smiled, the expression containing exactly 0 warmth. "Your client is concerned that his wife might have resources he didn't anticipate, that she might not be the helpless victim his strategy requires." Feldman's jaw tightened fractionally. "Mr. Vandermeer wishes to avoid protracted litigation. He's prepared to offer joint custody shared 50-50 and a settlement of $5 million. In exchange, Mrs. Vandermeer signs a comprehensive NDA and agrees not to contest the asset division outlined in the prenuptial agreement." $5 million. A fraction of what Thurston was worth, but more than Cordelia had possessed a month ago. The NDA was the key, though. Silence in exchange for money and access to her son. Marlowe pulled out her own documents, slid them across the table. Counter-proposal. Mrs. Vandermeer receives primary custody. Mr. Vandermeer gets supervised visitation pending completion of a financial audit examining his business practices over the past 5 years. Settlement of $50 million plus transfer of the Philadelphia penthouse to Mrs. Vandermeer's name. In exchange, she agrees not to cooperate with federal investigators currently examining irregularities in his casino operations. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Feldman's face went very still. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Your client has been laundering money for the Gallagher Group. $480 million over 3 years. The IRS has been notified. The SEC is opening an investigation, and Mrs. Vandermeer has documentation that would make prosecution very straightforward." Feldman looked at Thurston, who'd been silent until now. He sat at the end of the table wearing a suit that probably cost $10,000, his face carefully blank. But Cordelia could see tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. "This is extortion." Marlowe's smile was glacial. "No. Extortion would be threatening to release information unless you pay. We're offering to withhold cooperation with federal prosecutors in exchange for fair terms. That's negotiation. But if you'd prefer to characterize it as extortion, we can discuss that with the attorneys general, who'll be very interested in how you've been using charity foundation funds to pay back illegal gambling debts." The silence that followed felt explosive, like pressure building before detonation. Finally, Thurston spoke, his voice tight with control, slipping. "You have no idea what you're doing. The people I work with, they don't respond well to exposure. You think you're protecting Sebastian? You're painting a target on him." Cordelia felt ice crystallize in her veins. The threat was clear, barely coded. Augustus leaned forward, his voice carrying an edge Cordelia hadn't heard before. The genteel art collector vanished, replaced by something older and more dangerous. "Mr. Vandermeer, I've been operating in circles where actual danger exists since before you were born. The Gallaghers are businessmen with criminal side interests. Unpleasant, certainly, but not nearly as terrifying as they'd like you to believe. My family has been eliminating problems for 2 centuries. We're very good at it. Don't make yourself a problem." He stood, buttoned his suit jacket with movements that spoke of old money and older violence. "And understand this, if anything happens to Cordelia or Sebastian, I have resources that will make the federal investigation look gentle by comparison. Robert Gallagher is a second-generation criminal playing at being legitimate. My family wrote the playbook he's copying. We know every move before he makes it." The meeting ended without resolution. Feldman promised to consult with his client and respond within 48 hours. They left the building in tense silence, emerging onto streets full of people going about normal lives, unaware they'd just walked past a conference room where futures were being negotiated like commodity prices. On the sidewalk, Augustus touched Cordelia's arm. "I meant what I said about protection. The Gallaghers are dangerous, but they're also rational. They won't risk exposure by going after you directly. But Thurston might panic. Desperate men make stupid choices. Sebastian's already at your property in the Berkshires. He's safe there. Safe as anywhere. But Cordelia, we need to think about endgame. This can't stay in limbo. Either Thurston accepts reasonable terms or we go nuclear. And nuclear means federal prosecution, which means the Gallaghers decide whether Thurston's more valuable as a witness or a warning." She thought of Chen's screen showing 3 obituaries: car crash, boating accident, heart attack at 42. How do I keep him alive long enough to be a father, even a supervised one? "You make him valuable. You give the prosecutors what they really want, Robert Gallagher." Thurston's small time compared to his partner. "If you can deliver evidence that takes down the entire Gallagher operation, the U.S. Attorney's Office will protect Thurston as a key witness." That afternoon, Cordelia met with the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case. Her name was Richardson, early 40s, with the kind of focused intensity that came from working too many hours on too little sleep. "Chen's files are good, very good. We can build a RICO case against the Gallagher Group that would make the '90s mob trials look small. But we need testimony. Your husband's ideally. And anyone else inside the operation willing to flip. Sloane Gallagher. Richardson's eyebrows rose. Robert Gallagher's daughter? You have access to her? Not yet, but she's been calling the witness protection hotline. Chen tracked it. She wants out. If we could turn her if she'd testify against her father, that's the case. That's the whole case wrapped up with a bow. Richardson leaned back, studying Cordelia with new appreciation. You're not what I expected. Feldman's been painting you as an unstable housewife having a breakdown, but you're building a prosecution case. I'm protecting my son. If that means destroying my husband's criminal empire and the people who think they own him, so be it. Fair enough. Here's what I can offer: full immunity for your husband in exchange for testimony. Witness protection if needed. Same deal for Sloane Gallagher if you can deliver her. We move fast before the Gallaghers realize what's happening. Arrest warrants executed simultaneously across 4 states. We do it clean, we do it quick, and we make sure your family is nowhere near the fallout. When custody hearing is set for November 15th, that's in 5 days. We schedule federal testimony for November 20th. Grand jury indictments come down November 21st. By Thanksgiving, Robert Gallagher is in federal custody and your husband is in witness protection. Cordelia thought of Sebastian, 7 years old, about to have his world reshaped by forces he couldn't understand. And my son goes where the custody hearing determines. If you win primary custody, he stays with you. Your husband's witness protection doesn't affect that he'll have supervised visitation wherever the marshals relocate him. It was more than she'd hoped for. Justice and safety and Sebastian. I'll get you Sloane Gallagher. The call came that night. Cordelia was in the Berkshire house watching Sebastian sleep when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against better judgment, she answered, a woman's voice, young, uncertain. Mrs. Vandermeer, this is Sloane Gallagher. Please don't hang up. Cordelia's hand tightened on the phone. Give me one reason why I shouldn't. Because I can help you. I have evidence you don't, and I want to testify against my father. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Cordelia walked into the hallway, closed Sebastian's door softly. Why? Because I'm tired of being a pawn, tired of being loaned out like jewelry to keep men compliant, and because your husband actually fell in love with me, which wasn't supposed to happen. My father's furious, says Thurston's become a liability. They're planning to eliminate that liability. The word eliminate landed with weight. You're saying they're going to kill him. I'm saying accidents happen, especially to people who know too much and are about to testify. If you want Thurston alive to be a father to Sebastian, even a supervised one, you need to move faster than my family's timeline allows. What timeline? November 20th, the day he's scheduled to testify. He won't make it to the courthouse. My father's already made arrangements. It'll look natural. Heart attack, probably. Thurston's been under stress. No one will question it. Cordelia's mind raced. 5 days until the custody hearing. 10 until Thurston was supposed to testify. What do you want in exchange for this information? Witness protection, immunity, a life that isn't defined by my last name. Can you make that happen? I can try. But Sloane, if you're lying, if this is some kind of setup. It's not. I'll send you proof. Files my father keeps. Recordings. Everything you need to put him away and keep yourself safe. And Mrs. Vandermeer, I really did fall in love with Thurston. I know that makes me the villain in your story. But he saw me as more than a tool. That was new. The call ended. 30 seconds later, an encrypted email arrived with attachments, audio files of Robert Gallagher discussing the planned hit on Thurston. Financial records showing payments to people who'd carried out the previous 3 accidents. Communications between Gallagher and the men who'd killed the accountant, the partner, the journalist. Cordelia forwarded everything to Richardson with a single line. Sloane Gallagher is ready to flip. Move up the timeline. The response came within an hour. Warrants being prepared now. Arrests go down November 14th. 3 days. Get your son somewhere safe. The custody hearing happened in a conference room in family court, intimate and claustrophobic. Thurston sat across from Cordelia Feldman beside him, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a month. The bags under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. His hands trembled slightly when he signed documents. The judge was a woman named Martinez, 50-something, with the exhausted patience of someone who'd spent 20 years watching families destroy themselves in her courtroom. "We're here to determine custody arrangements for Sebastian Vandermeer, age 7, Mr. Feldman. I've reviewed your petition for primary custody based on concerns about Mrs. Vandermeer's stability. I've also reviewed the psychiatric evaluation you submitted from Dr. Harrington." She paused, looked over her glasses at Feldman. "I've also reviewed the counter-evaluation submitted by Dr. Chen, the financial disclosures provided by Mrs. Vandermeer's counsel, and some very interesting documentation from the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding Mr. Vandermeer's business practices." Thurston went pale. Martinez continued, her voice dry. "Mr. Vandermeer, I'm not in the habit of awarding primary custody to parents currently under federal investigation for money laundering and fraud. Even if your wife were unstable, which the evidence does not support, you would not be my first choice for primary caregiver." Feldman tried to object, but Martinez cut him off. "Save it. I've seen the recordings, the financial documents. Your client is looking at serious federal charges. Mrs. Vandermeer, on the other hand, has demonstrated remarkable stability under circumstances that would break most people." She signed an order, handed it to the clerk. "Primary physical custody to Cordelia Sterling Vandermeer. Father gets supervised visitation 2 weekends per month pending resolution of federal charges. If Mr. Vandermeer is convicted and incarcerated, we'll revisit visitation arrangements at that time." Cordelia felt something unknot in her chest. Sebastian. She'd won Sebastian. Across the table, Thurston looked like a man watching the last piece of his world crumble. After the hearing, he caught her in the hallway. Feldman had disappeared, presumably to start damage control. They stood in the corridor alone for the first time since that night in the penthouse. "You won." His voice was flat empty. "I won the right to keep my son safe. That's all I ever wanted. They're going to arrest me tomorrow. Richardson's office called. Said I should get my affairs in order." "Then cooperate. Testify. Take the immunity deal. Be alive to be Sebastian's father, even if it's just video calls and supervised visits. And spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. The Gallaghers don't forgive. You saw what Chen showed you. The accidents. Sloane's testifying against them. She's got recordings, documents. The Gallaghers are going down whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you survive it." Thurston laughed, bitter and broken. "Sloane, I actually thought she loved me. Turns out she was just looking for an exit strategy." "Maybe both things are true." He looked at her, then really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. "When did you get so strong?" "I was always strong. You just needed me weak." She walked away, left him standing in the corridor of family court, a man who'd gambled everything on the wrong assumptions. November 14th arrived cold and clear. Cordelia woke in the Berkshire house to frost on the windows and Sebastian asking if they could build a snowman, even though there wasn't enough snow yet. Normal child questions. Normal morning. At 9 a.m., federal agents executed arrest warrants simultaneously in Boston, Atlantic City, New York, and Philadelphia. Robert Gallagher was taken into custody at his office. Thurston was arrested at the penthouse. 3 other Gallagher associates were picked up at various locations. Sloane Gallagher walked into the FBI field office in Boston, voluntarily accompanied by lawyers Richardson had arranged, and began giving testimony that would dismantle her father's empire piece by piece. By noon, it was national news. CNN ran footage of Robert Gallagher being led out of his office in handcuffs. The Wall Street Journal posted breaking news about the Gallagher Group's illegal gambling operations. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a front-page story about Thurston Vandermeer's arrest, complete with photos from his glory days when he'd been celebrated as a self-made success. Cordelia watched the coverage from the Berkshire house while Sebastian played in the next room, oblivious. Victoria had driven up to be with her along with Augustus, both of them, understanding that even victory felt strange when it came wrapped in destruction. "You did it." Victoria's voice held awe and something like pride. I did what I had to. Augustus poured 3 glasses of scotch, handed them around. Your grandmother would be proud. She spent 40 years in a marriage to a man who treated her like property, survived by being smarter, more patient, more strategic. You did it in 7 years. Cordelia thought of the vault in Philadelphia, the paintings that had bought her freedom, the letter her grandmother had left. Don't let them make you small. Don't let them convince you that survival is the same as victory. She'd done more than survive. She'd won. Primary custody, financial independence, justice for the crimes Thurston had committed, but she'd also ensured Sebastian would grow up with a father in witness protection, testifying against organized crime, living under constant threat. That was the cost. The peace she'd carry forever. Her phone rang. Richardson. It's done. Gallagher's being held without bail. Flight risk. His lawyers are already trying to cut deals, but we've got him cold. Sloane's testimony alone would be enough. With your husband's cooperation and the financial records, it's airtight. And Thurston accepted the immunity deal. He'll testify, then go into witness protection. The marshals are setting up his new identity now. He'll be able to do video calls with Sebastian, supervised visits a few times a year. Not ideal, but he's alive. That's all I wanted. For Sebastian to have a father, even if it's complicated. After she hung up, Cordelia walked to the window. The pond was starting to freeze at the edges, ice forming in patterns that looked like fractals. Sebastian's voice drifted from the other room, singing something he'd learned at school. Victoria came to stand beside her. What now? Now I go back to Philadelphia, raise my son, sell some paintings when I need money, and keep the rest because they're beautiful and they're mine. Maybe go back to school, finish that art history degree I abandoned. Live the life I was supposed to have before I let someone convince me I was supposed to be small. And Thurston will be Sebastian's father from whatever city the marshals put him in. We'll work it out. People do harder things. Augustus joined them at the window, the 3 of them watching the afternoon light fade over the pond. The Vandermeer Foundation. What are you going to do about that? Cordelia smiled, the expression containing edges she'd learned to sharpen over the past month. Rename it. The Sterling Foundation. My grandmother's maiden name. Use it the way it was supposed to be used, funding art programs for underprivileged kids, scholarships for women in art history, grants for museums in communities that can't afford them. Every dollar Thurston stole from it, I'll make work for something that matters. He won't like that. He doesn't have to. He signed over his board seat as part of the settlement. I control it now. What he thinks is irrelevant. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so powerful that their opinion no longer matters. That night, after Sebastian was asleep, Cordelia opened her laptop and drafted an email to Columbia University. She'd been accepted to their art history PhD program 15 years ago, deferred to marry Thurston, eventually let the acceptance lapse. Worth asking if they'd reconsider. The response came the next morning from the department chair, a woman named Dr. Morrison, who remembered Cordelia's undergraduate thesis on Dutch Golden Age painting. We'd be delighted to welcome you to the program. Your life experience has only enhanced what was already exceptional potential. Classes begin in January. I look forward to working with you. Cordelia read the email 3 times, feeling something unlock in her chest. The future spreading out ahead of her like a landscape newly visible. She walked to Sebastian's room, found him awake and building an elaborate Lego space station. Mom, when can we go home? Home. The penthouse that had been her prison, now legally hers. The city where she'd lost herself, now the place she'd reclaim. Soon, baby. Just a few more days. Then we go back to Philadelphia and we start fresh. Will Daddy be there? The question she'd been dreading. Not at first. Daddy has to go away for a while, for work. But he loves you very much, and you'll get to talk to him on video calls, and maybe visit him sometimes. Sebastian considered this the way 7-year-olds processed information that didn't quite make sense but had to be accepted anyway. Okay, can I bring my Legos when we go home? You can bring everything. December arrived with the first real snow. Cordelia and Sebastian moved back to the Philadelphia penthouse, which felt different now that it belonged to her alone. She sold the furniture that reminded her of Thurston, kept pieces she actually liked, hung some of the lesser paintings from the vault, nothing museum quality but beautiful, and started making the space feel like a home rather than a showplace. Sebastian adjusted better than she'd feared. Video calls with Thurston happened twice a week, supervised by a social worker who ensured the conversations stayed appropriate. Thurston looked different on screen, older, diminished, speaking from locations he couldn't name, wearing clothes that weren't custom-tailored. But he tried. Asked about Sebastian's homework and Lego projects and whether he'd made the soccer team. Tried to be a father from whatever witness protection city the marshals had stashed him in. It wasn't the family Sebastian had been born into, but it was honest. And that was more than Cordelia could say for the previous 7 years. On Christmas Eve, Victoria and Augustus came for dinner. They ate in the dining room overlooking the city, glasses of wine that actually tasted good rather than expensive conversation that ranged from art to politics to Sebastian's conviction that Santa definitely used quantum physics to deliver presents globally in one night. After Sebastian went to bed, the three of them sat in the living room, fire crackling, the city lights spread out below. "I got the Vermeer authenticated." Augustus looked up from his wine. "And it's real. 35th known Vermeer in existence. The appraiser nearly cried, said it's worth somewhere between 80 and 100 million at auction." Victoria let out a low whistle. "So you're not just rich. You're obscenely rich." "I'm comfortable. And Sebastian's education is funded through graduate school. And the Sterling Foundation can do actual good in the world. That's enough." Augustus raised his glass. "To Lillian Sterling, who knew that the best way to beat men at their own game was to change the rules entirely." They drank to that. To Cordelia's grandmother, who'd survived by planning decades ahead. To the paintings that had bought freedom. To the 7-year-old asleep upstairs who'd never know how close he'd come to losing his mother. Later, after Victoria and Augustus had left, Cordelia stood at the window looking out at Philadelphia, the city she'd lived in for a decade but barely seen, too focused on being the person Thurston needed her to be. She was done being that person. Her phone buzzed. An email from Dr. Morrison with the spring semester syllabus. Seminars on Renaissance iconography and 19th century art markets, research methodologies and archival practices, the academic life she'd abandoned, now waiting for her to reclaim it. She thought about Thurston in witness protection, testifying against the Gallaghers, living with consequences. Thought about Sloane in her own protected location, building whatever life came after betraying your family for the chance at something real. Thought about Sebastian asleep in his room, innocent of the war that had been waged to keep him safe. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so powerful that their opinion no longer matters. Cordelia had done more than survive her husband's betrayal. She'd reclaimed her name, her legacy, her future. Had turned survival into victory, not through violence but through strategy. Not through hatred but through refusing to be diminished. She opened the locket that hung at her throat, looked at the empty space where the vault key had been. The key now lived in a safe deposit box at First Bank of Philadelphia, along with the documentation for paintings worth more than Thurston's entire empire. The Sterling legacy, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from one woman who refused to be broken to another who'd learned the same lesson. She closed the locket, felt its familiar weight against her skin. Tomorrow she'd take Sebastian ice skating at City Hall. They'd drink hot chocolate and sing off-key carols and be a family of two, which was enough. More than enough. It was everything.